Good morning, sanibonani, molweni, goeiemorgen, abusheni, ndimachiloni once again to you, ladies and gentlemen, that are joining us from wherever you are at the comfort of your home. We're so happy to have you. And thank you for staying with us. You are so loyal to us, quite a loyal partner. Thank you. We highly appreciate your presence. I hope you did have some bit of a body stretch or maybe went to grab a cup of something to drink. I'll recommend coffee or tea, at least water that will do. And you're now refreshed and ready to absorb all the information that we've prepared for you with our seasoned experts of panel that you're looking forward to be listening to over the next couple of minutes or a couple of or maybe an hour or so. They'll be sharing with us all the information that you need to know. Please remember, we are still live on the socials. We're going with the hashtag GTech Winter School 2022. That's GTech Winter School 2022 in all the socials. Quite importantly, if you may follow us or just add us in your network in the LinkedIn space, that's where we'll advertise our weekly webinars where you will be empowered as a public economics scholar or any scholar for that matter. So do the right thing and engage with us on all the socials as I indicated. All right, resources are available. Remember to navigate through the resources center there and get all the resources that you need. There's so much in store for you to get all the information, especially that pertains to today's sessions and the previous sessions that we had earlier on yesterday as well as Tuesday. Today is the final session of our 2022 GTech Winter School. This session that we're going to now will speak about, as I said before the break, how do we sustain a basic service delivery? Is it something that we just throw a concrete and come back 10 years later? Or does it require maintenance? When there are shocks, when there are potholes, how do we deal with such things? It speaks to sustaining service delivery in the local municipalities. And we have a lineup of speakers, starting with Lubabalo, there's Luren, there's Letsepa, Dr. Letsepa Pakkies, there's Kolisang from National Treasury as well. So look forward to those speakers. You don't want to move. Whilst they speak, right? Whilst we have a speaker on stage, be like Sillo. If you know someone in this winter school by now, there's a gentleman called Sillo. Sillo has a question for every speaker. So I need someone to take Sillo on. Please, if you can challenge Sillo, do so. But let's give Sillo some love. Show Sillo some love with reaction emojis there for doing a fantastic job of asking all those good questions. And we're looking forward to also reading some of your questions and going on the socials to read some of your tweets and other platforms where you did comment. I did say one of the speakers decided online is not for me. We are post-COVID, so let me do a real thing and join the studio. Joining me today, this morning, is our first speaker, Lubabalo. Hi, Lubabalo.
Hello, Usi. How are you?
Thank you for asking. How are you?
I'm well. Are you well?
Doing fantastic. I'm trying my best. We've been here since Tuesday. We are here. Today I was a bit worried that I'll be bored, and you rocked up. I'm like, there we have it. We
Having
now have a
watched the
partner.
previous 2 days, I simply could not miss the opportunity to come and sit with you and join you today on this very lively session that you're having.
Fantastic, Ben. Fantastic. And those that know Lubabalo or may not, I'll remind you that Lubabalo is a senior public infrastructure development practitioner. Having worked in both the private and the public sector as an engineer, he has specific competencies in the complete public infrastructure development value chain with specific interest in municipal infrastructure related issues. Lubabalo holds a BSc honors in civil engineering from the University of Cape Town, UCT, a Bachelor of Engineering honors in water utilization engineer from the University of Pretoria, and Lubabalo is a professional registered engineer with the Engineering Council of South Africa. Lubabalo was most recently the director of the project management and coordination at the Municipal Infrastructure Agent, otherwise known to us as MISA or MISA. In this role, he was responsible for various strategic municipal infrastructure programs. Lubabalo is currently the water and sanitation specialist at the South African Local Government Association, popularly known as SALGA. I'm sure you agree with me that this is the right man to speak about how do we sustain service delivery. And Lubabalo will talk to us for the next 20 minutes whilst you deposit your questions in the chat or in the Q&A section. Remember to upvote questions that you think deserve your ear or questions that deserve to be asked to him. Then we'll carry on with the rest of the speakers. Now turning to Lubabalo.
Thank you very much, Vusi, for that introduction, and a good morning to one and all that is joining us virtually. I'll be looking at municipal water and sanitation, a critical reflection on status quo. I think just as a disclaimer, if the sustainable provision of water and sanitation services, but more broadly, municipal infrastructure services were very easy, I think we would have cracked it by now. It's quite a complex space, and mine is not to try and present simple solutions that obviously would not work, but to enrich the discussion by sharing some observations and discussions and critical things that we would need to consider if we were to be successful in this very important endeavor as a country. In terms of the outline, we're doing 4 things. It's just a bit of a background for orientation, and then sector challenges, the known, and then towards sustainable service delivery. In there, we will look at 4 subtopics: integrated infrastructure development, the matter of functionality, that of infrastructure and the institutions that are charged with delivering these key services, in particular water. And then an interesting one, the debate of equity, efficiency trade-offs, or are we able to get both equity and efficiency? I think as a country, we've not really been able to do both of those. And the question then becomes why and what do we do going forward? And then we will look at, I think, the favorite as taxpayers, infrastructure expenditure efficiency. That's what we are constantly bombarded with in terms of how municipalities are doing. In terms of SALGA, to give you a little bit of a background for those that may not know SALGA, SALGA is the South African Local Government Association. We are responsible for lobbying, advocating, and representing local government. We're an employer body responsible for capacity building, support and advice, strategic profiling, and knowledge and information sharing. So in a nutshell, that's who the South African Local Government Association is. Then into a little bit of background for orientation. There's quite a bit happening on the slides, but we will start, I think, with our top right corner, which is the Constitution. Our previous presenters have taken us through Section 24 and Sections 27 of the Constitution that make water and sanitation services provision what we call rights-based services. And then we've got below that the medium-term strategic framework, where we've got 4 goals. We want to see 100% water service authority functionality through something that is called the Municipal Strategic Self-Assessment Tool. That's something on the left, which looks at effective water services management. We also want to see 90% access to sanitation and hygiene, 95% reliability of water services, and 100% functionality of wastewater treatment works. I think the previous presentation touched on quite a bit in terms of where we are with regards to these. I reserve my opinion in terms of whether or not I think we will reach these targets that are very ambitious. And when one considers the current state of local government, you would not be labeled a pessimist to think that we're not likely to achieve these. But I think as a useful framework, we can define sustainable water and sanitation services through the meeting of these 4 particular targets. Obviously, there's the sustainable development goals. I think that's been touched on. There's the National Development Plan, and then we have the district development model as well to contend with in terms of just the scene or the issues we need to consider. I think of interest, the Department of Water and Sanitation has done really good work in defining what effective water services management looks like. And it's got deals with skills, deals with the infrastructure itself, resource management, finances, information systems, et cetera, et cetera. That is what is on our top left on the slides. And then in terms of just the challenges themselves, I think, and I've called these the known, because I think we all know the challenges. But again, it's quite important. We are in a democratic state that is unitary, that has 3 spheres, national, provincial, and local. And those 3 spheres are interdependent and interlinked. So that just, what we've got there is a little picture that just really summarizes how these 3 spheres are supposed to be working together towards, you could say, the NDP, which is on our top left. And obviously local government being not the lowest sphere of government, but the sphere closest to the people, typically has to contend with all of that complexity that you see on your screen in order to provide, or rather to successfully provide sustainable water and sanitation services. An emerging discussion as it pertains to this is whether or not our regulatory framework is actually inhibiting or enabling. There's lots of talk about South Africa having really progressive and amazing policy and legislation, but when we look at the results of that, we are left with many question marks. So the question becomes, is the problem the legislative environment or those who are charged with implementing that particular legislation? And I think it's a bit of both. But yeah, it would be interesting to get other views on that. But I think it's not one or the other. And then when we go to the next slide, specifically coming to municipal infrastructure challenges in the context that we've painted, we've got, I've used a framework that says we've got events, we've got patterns and trends, and then we've got the systemic and the structural issues. The challenge with this is in terms of how municipalities typically approach, or government as a whole, approach resolving service delivery challenges, is that we become fixated on one. It's either we're exclusively dealing with events or exclusively dealing with patterns and trends, or exclusively trying to look at the systemic and the structural. Whereas the right approach would perhaps be to look at a blend of issues and work together collectively. Because if you look at the systemic and the structural, a single municipality cannot really resolve those. It's something that is more at a policy and a legislative level, which would sit at a provincial or national government level. But again, in municipalities, unfortunately, sometimes due to the pressures, you'll find municipalities exclusively dealing with events, which is attending to sewer spillages, potholes, leaks, solid waste on streets, etc., but never getting to the question of that says, what is the cause of these things, and what do we therefore do to deal with that pattern and trend? And then national and provincial government coming to the party and starting to deal with the systemic and the structural. Again, that would be a framework I would put forward in terms of how we should respond to our municipal infrastructure challenges, and in particular, water and sanitation. And that's something that we are perhaps not doing. So the question is, how do we do that? Or rather, why are we not doing that? And how do we move towards that? And I'd like to deposit just one thought on this slide, which is the centrality of data to enable evidence-based decision-making that says we are taking this decision informed by a variable or on the premise that the cause is 1, 2, 3, 4. The result that we want to see is this and this and this. And again, I think, as you would have heard over the last few days, we've got a serious challenge as it pertains to data, credible data and information, at least on public infrastructure. And municipalities are no exception to that. So again, one has to ask, are we able to move forward towards sustainable service delivery if we do not resolve this problem of data, or see this issue of the centrality and importance of dealing with data, or rather not seeing this issue of dealing with data and information with the urgency and the seriousnast that it deserves. Then there's this other matter. I think, again, as a country, coming from a scenario, our past that we come from, we've focused a lot on building new infrastructure and the eradication of backlogs, and looking after that infrastructure as something that has unfortunately fallen by the wayside. And that act of planning, building, and then effectively looking after the infrastructure that you've built is called technically asset management. So this is just an overview of what asset management is, a useful framework. And in red, I've just circled the boxes that indicate where most municipalities, I don't want to say all, most municipalities are struggling. And you can see we've basically got a crisis when we talk about asset management. And colleagues, I want to put to you that without effective infrastructure asset management, reliable service provision is just, well, is but a pipe dream. So again, this is one of the areas that we really need to look at as all of government, to say, how do we improve public infrastructure asset management? But municipalities, of course, are what we are concerned with today, and they are no exception to this challenge. And again, just for data points, we've recently released or seen the release of the 2022 Green Drop Report, which paints an appalling picture in terms of the state of our sanitation infrastructure. Next year, we're going to have the Blue Drop Report coming out 31 March 2023. We already know what those results are going to tell us as it pertains to our water infrastructure. And again, as you all experience water, or rather municipal services every day, you know for yourself that we're not where we would like to be. And so again, the core here is to say we need to look at the entire picture and not just be dealing with smaller things or other individual things, or just building new infrastructure, which has become the fixation. And then in terms of just looking forward, I think it's very easy to speak on the problems. I found a particularly interesting model that really gives us a sense of the complexity that is involved in infrastructure development. One, we need to accept that there's a correlation or relationship between the different types of services, between water and sanitation, but also the other municipal infrastructure services. You can see that on your, let's call it the y-axis on the left-hand side. And that interaction happens at a local level, but also infrastructure that is owned by provincial government and national government. But then we get to the real complexity, which is on our x-axis, the social systems, the economic systems, and the political systems. And those have a direct bearing on our ability to effectively develop infrastructure. And what is often the case is that we oversimplify the interconnectedness of infrastructure and the interdependencies in effective infrastructure development, and we end up developing solutions that are not appropriate. So again, here the call is simply to say we need to appreciate how complex public infrastructure development is and proceed with due caution as we take that forward. Otherwise, we will not see any improvement. Then functionality. I think everyone is quite concerned about the state of municipalities. There's some work that's being done around the functionality of municipalities. This is aggregated at a district level, being done at the Urban and Public Infrastructure Research Initiative. As you can see, the red is dysfunctionality. So we've got these patches of red. And again, the question to ask here is, what are the underlying events? What are the patterns and the trends? What are the systemic and the structural issues? And how do we therefore respond? But interestingly, as we want to underscore the importance of data, when you take that analysis over various financial years, you start to see a pattern emerge. You look at provinces like the Northwest, I think there's no argument around the state of municipalities in that province, and you can see the extensive red that is ever increasing. The question then becomes, when municipal functionality is not improving year on year at a provincial level, is the problem just municipalities, or is provincial and national government also not functional? And this is premised on the understanding that the Constitution says the three spheres are distinctive, interdependent, and interrelated. And again, what we often have in our country is an overfixation on what municipalities are not doing right, and everyone else gets a free pass that's actually responsible for, at the worst, intervening. So again, we need to really bring accountability across the system if we want to see meaningful improvement in the system. And then there's this big debate around equity, efficiency trade-offs, or if we can actually get equity and efficiency. We did some work as SALGA around this particular area, and the results were quite interesting. So one of the things that's being put forward is that the assumptions in the local government white paper are not valid. And so the state of municipalities will continue deteriorating because they simply don't have the funds to do what they need to do. I think we can see there some analysis in terms of what the assumptions of the white paper were versus what municipalities on aggregate are actually doing. And obviously the challenge here is that this is aggregated data. So you'll see this is exaggerated. When you look at metros, they're doing well. But when you go to a district municipality, the picture is horrendous. And again, how is a municipality that is not financially viable supposed to be providing services? This is not exonerating the municipalities and saying that they cannot improve. We'll see that when we get to the next slide. But an interesting thing, we look at property rates. The South African Cities Network did a very interesting study. So property rates seem to be doing quite well. But the question we must ask is one of unintended consequences. This doing well, what cost has it come at? So we're a country that says we want to deal with the apartheid spatial planning legacy, yet we are incentivizing, in fact, forcing municipalities to maximize their property rates. What does that look like? It says keep the same. The rich must stay together so that we get as much property rates as possible. And that's great, right, for the finances. But in terms of our broader objectives as a country and where we want to go and the type of society that we want to build, are we actually helping or hurting? That's a question that I think we need to answer, and something that highlights the complexity in public infrastructure development and the challenges, or the things that one needs to consider as they do this particular work. Then expenditure efficiency. Again, a lot of municipalities, I think we can agree, are not being as efficient as we would like. But again, let's bear in mind the trade-offs, equity, efficiency. So as much as we want to see every cent develop infrastructure, we want to simultaneously be creating jobs. So there's a level of inefficiency that we are willing to live with because of the broader objectives that we want to be achieving as a society. So we just took the largest conditional grants over a period of 3 years. Or 3 financial years. You can see there we're talking about 50 billion per year. So that's about 192.3 billion being allocated with an expenditure of 91%. And then this compares to the MIG from its inception in 2004. And then we'll talk about the MIG itself. If we look at 2014 to 2021, we spent about 105 billion. Spent expenditures about 94%, and you can see the results in terms of the expenditure or what is reported. But again, I want to challenge us to say it's one thing to spend, but are we asking these other fundamental questions which are on the bottom right, which is one, by how much have we reduced backlogs since we have been spending? Two, what is the current state? What is the state of this infrastructure? Three, were projects completed on time, within budget, and to the desired quality in the spending of this money? And also questions of sustainability, resilience, and equity. To what extent are those considered? And again, in as much as municipalities are guilty of not performing well there, we have to ask provincial and national government, to what extent are you playing your role in ensuring that these fundamentals are in place and that we are moving in the direction that we'd like to be moving as a country? I think it's a bit naive of us to expect local government to hold itself accountable. This goes back to my earlier point that says we need to bring accountability across the system if we are to function, because that's how the system is designed. So some key takeaways as I conclude. The first is that we need to have an appreciation of the complexity and interdependency in this venture that's in the government design and also in public infrastructure development, which I would call a complex socio-technical system. And again, a lot of us sometimes oversimplify these things and we wonder why we end up with the challenges that we do. The second is that I think we need to critically reflect on the regulatory environment. Is it enabling or inhibiting, and what do we therefore do about that? The third, I think, is that we need to start institutionalizing evidence-based decision-making for continuous improvement. Again, when the base data is not there, that's almost impossible. So decisions are made on the virtue of who shouts the loudest or who has the most power. And I think as a country, that moves us nowhere. The next is that we need to measure and invest in what we want to see changed. Again, if we talk about efficiency in public infrastructure development, what indicators are there? Where could you even go to see that type of data beyond expenditure? Because I think we can all agree that simply spending the money means nothing sometimes. The next is we need to consider the absorptive capacity of the system when making changes. Again, we always come up with wonderful ideas and programs that seem to not be cognizant of the reality of the context in which these will be applied. And we end up with white elephant programs, if you call them. The other is that we need to make difficult choices that balance the many important competing needs as a country. And we also need to be on the constant lookout for unintended consequences of the decisions that we make. Because of the complexity of the system, colleagues, I think we are going to have unintended consequences. We are going to make mistakes. But if we are working often in an environment that is open to continuously improving, I think we can move forward. And I think the last one is this trade-off between equity and efficiency. Is there a trade-off, or it's actually possible to be equitable and efficient? I will not venture to try and answer that. It would be lovely to hear some views on what people think about that. But again, in looking at our past as South Africa and where we want to go, one could argue that we need to, it's a trade-off between equity and efficiency. We cannot just blatantly go for efficiency at all costs, as it has unintended consequences. And with that, that would be the conclusion of my input in the sustainable provision of municipal infrastructure services, considering in particular the case of water and sanitation services. Thank you.
Mhlekazi, thank you so much. Thank you, Mhlekazi. Thank you, Lubabalo. That's Lubabalo talking around municipal water and sanitation service provision. And I like how you sort of gave an appreciation of how the system is complex. There are regulations that are there that needs to be reviewed, but at the same time, we need to be accountable for us to improve our services. So thank you for that reflection. A few questions have come in for you. We'll look into them a bit later on as we proceed with our program towards the tail end of this session. But now we move swiftly to our next speaker, Lauren, I think, Hermanus from ADAPT, to speak about the Urban Just Transition Project. I'm not sure if Lauren is with us on the visual stage. Good morning, Lauren.
Hi, good morning. I'm sorry, I must apologize. My internet is absolutely appalling.
We'll try our best to have you in still. We understand. Thank you. Lauren, let me just introduce you to our audience here. so they could appreciate the wealth of experience that you're going to bring on the table this morning. So Lauren is the founder and director of Adapt, and she has more than 10 years of experience in sustainable development research and practice. During her career, she has worked in private and public sectors, academia, and with NGOs, focusing specifically on sustainable energy transition, urban resilience, and green economic development. Through How We Adapt, she has initiated a Just Urban, the transition project, which aims to understand the support of the low carbon transition across level of organizations in policy planning and implementation. Lauren has an academic background in complexity and system thinking with a Masters of Arts in Philosophy and Development with a Masters of Philosophy in Development Policy and Practice. Through her work, ladies and gentlemen, she has demonstrated her particular interest in decentralized development and collaborative distributed solutions to complex programs. Whew, that's mouthful. It shows a lot how wealth of experience you can expect from you, Lauren. And whenever you're ready, please, you can go ahead. Welcome.
Great, thank you. So thank you very much for that very generous and kind introduction. I'm going to ask that our colleagues share the presentation from their side as we agreed, just because, yeah, there's some technical issues. I'm en route via Limpopo back to Cape Town. So lots going on in the just transition. Fantastic. So I am going to be speaking about electricity service provision as a specific focus area within this complex low carbon transition. I really want to thank and echo my colleague from SALGA for the way in which he framed some of these issues that are on the table, really firstly challenging us, I think, to think in a systemic way, that in so many ways at the urban scale, issues of infrastructure development and service provision are not sector specific, but are have so many areas of complementarity and overlap that really need to be thought about, whether you're pursuing efficiency, as he mentioned, or equity on the other hand. Those intersections are really critical to think about. Which municipalities are doing well, which kinds of municipalities are succeeding, and in what way, also another issue to think about. And then, he mentioned also the local government white paper, and in energy we also have a white paper. These documents are old and, in my view, completely out of date and no longer fit for purpose, and we need to find different points of reference, and we need to bring them together into coherent frameworks for action. So yes, okay, let's jump right into it. My presentation really focuses on goals, challenges, and responses for transforming local electricity systems. I want to say up front, I'm not an engineer, clearly, from that introduction. However, in getting to this presentation, it's been part of a collaborative process, which has included inputs from engineers, from people who work on the fiscal side of municipal issues, and on various different aspects. So it's a systems view of the challenge of transition, focusing on the power system. So thank you very much. If we could just have a look and just remind ourselves on that first slide, so we can go away from the title slide. On the first slide, what I have here is just a reminder that the just transition, which is this term that's being bandied about everywhere at the moment, is really a response to three interconnected but distinct processes. And the one is the coal transition, which is obviously about decommissioning of coal power stations and a decline of associated value chains, and all the myriad of impacts that are connected there. Then we have the renewable energy transition, which is its own complex socio-technical process, which is about the increased penetration of renewable energy at various scales, within our transmission network, and also embedded in our distribution networks as well, the structural impacts on energy markets, governance, management, value chains, etc. And then we have to think about really the broad socio-economic reconfiguration that is happening across industrial sectors, residential sectors as well, in response to these two other processes. And so, the first part of that, and the really historical injustice and the emergent injustices have where we focused a lot of our attention as a country, and then also on Eskom, that's where we focused a lot of our attention as a country, really trying to mitigate impacts there. But we forget about process number 2 and process number 3, and that really across the country, whether you're dealing with coal-affected municipalities or not, are critical areas of activity that need to be considered, as we pursue our goal of universal energy access, equitable energy access, and energy access that supports green economic development as well. So there hasn't been a lot of attention on the municipal aspects of that challenge, and we can see that in the just transition policy that is emerging, whether that's driven from the energy side of things, from the environmental side of things. Really, municipalities have been something of an afterthought. And I think that that's not because of a lack of work that's happening at a municipal scale. There's a huge amount of work that's happening at a municipal scale, but this is not brought together in any coherent way, through a sort of a determined and deliberate national intervention to manage both the risks and opportunities at the local scale, but across the entire system of the country. So if we can go then to slide 3, or the next slide. Okay, so this slide here is really a summary. Much like my colleague, I take a socio-technical view of this transformation, and we think, okay, so what is it that's transitioning within the power sector, but at a local scale? So it's multiple things at once. So there's technical innovation, which is about really embedded generation. Up to now, it's been sort of small scale embedded generation, but due to recent shifts and regulations, it's not just small scale embedded generation. It can also be large utility scale embedded generation, energy storage, the rise of smart grids, for example, also using technological various technologies to sense and generate data that allows for different and automated management of distribution grids, and also on the horizon that local governments are already having to think about the integration of electric vehicles as that transition takes place as well. We're seeing changes in policy and in law. The sort of small scale embedded generation has been a long time coming, more than a decade of development, really driven by the municipalities there, obviously in relationship with NERSA as well. More recently, we've seen changes in the Electricity Regulation Act, the ERA, as well as the electricity pricing policy, as well as wheeling, being a significant area of work, an emergent area of work that's still not entirely clarified for municipalities or for Eskom, actually. Then we see a new role for actors, for old actors, and new roles for new actors as well. That really municipalities are thinking about themselves, not just as on-sellers of Eskom's electricity, but really having to think of themselves as energy service entities. I don't want to say companies, because they're not necessarily run like businesses, and it's not their job to operate like businesses, although we would like them to be financially viable, to be able to cover their costs, whether through national subsidies or local cross-subsidization. This is something that's really up for debate, and also an area that demands some good focused thinking. And then that municipal finances, it's been said over and over again, I think, in various public forums, that the way that municipalities use electricity within their revenue models is not working very well for them, and that there are tremendous concerns about the implication and incentives that this this arrangement, this fiscal arrangement, produces for different municipalities that really demands urgent attention. So what we have here is that the electricity transition creates certain challenges and opportunities that are unique to the local scale and to the context of distribution networks. That distinct local conditions, including demographic issues, financial issues, economic, environmental, etc., really determine how national policies and regulatory changes land on the ground, and whether or not they are feasible, whether or not they have unintended negative consequences within particular municipalities. And that also we have municipalities that are really variably positioned to respond to all of these changes. Of course, we have seen a huge amount of action. Our colleagues at SALGA have been instrumental in those processes of change, really also looking at tracking how SSEG has, small scale embedded generation has really skyrocketed. Actually, and that the official uptake, the sort of registered systems, are only a partial representation of the uptake of embedded generation, which of course causes its own problems for local system management. So if we could go to the next slide. So in the absence of, sorry, we skipped one. Yeah, perfect. So in the absence of a coherent national conversation, the Just Urban Transition Project partnered with WWF South Africa and with the Center for Sustainable and Renewable Energy Studies at Stellenbosch University, which has been quite involved in supporting, both of those entities have been quite involved in trying to understand the electricity transition at the municipal scale, and supporting local governments in making sense of this transition, the risks and opportunities, and certainly also issues of equitable service delivery, as well as sustainable service delivery, sustainable in the fact that it can be sustained, and sustainable in the fact of also obviously being cognizant and aligned to environmental and climate imperatives as well. So we published this report, which is available on the Just Urban Transitions website, which is really the outcome of a sort of three-step process that we undertook a review of existing policy that's related to the question of electricity transition, also engaging with various officials and various stakeholders in this transition, and then convening a series of workshops. Up to this report, it was 2 workshops, and then we've actually had a 3rd workshop just last week, in which we actually started to plot the way forward. These workshops are not, it wasn't a representative sample, so this wasn't a political process. What we really aimed to do was to identify stakeholders who we know to be implementing interesting initiatives, really wrestling with really challenges and opportunities within this transition in electricity infrastructure configurations, and so these actors are embedded within municipalities, metropolitan municipalities, local municipalities. We even had a district municipality as well that's sort of forging ahead with very innovative responses to the transition, to make sense together, to get a very quick sense of where the issues are, where the challenges are, where the opportunities are, and also to start to articulate what appropriate goals for the just transition might be at the local scale. So there's been a lot of attention to what just transition goals are at the national scale, but we know that national policies don't scale down at different levels of organization and planning. The system looks very different, and you need a distinct understanding and response at that level to be effective. So the first thing that we did was to move on to goal setting and ask, what might a goal be for the just transition? So this is not meant to be the last word. It specifically was framed as actually being a first word, or one of the first words, bringing together all kinds of very effective and clever people who are working on these issues across the country, and saying, let's just put some ideas out there so that they can be debated, so that they can be even torn down and replaced with better ideas, but to start this conversation around the just transition. So if we go to the next slide, what we have here is our collective articulation of what an aim might be. And this actually comes from, it was an idea put on the table by a municipal official at a metro, and it was something that's an idea that got increasingly more traction as our conversations have unfolded. And this is that a long-term vision at the distribution scale might be to facilitate just and sustainable, again, sustainable as in can be continued, and sustainable as in aligned to climate and ecological goals as well, just and sustainable grid communities. So that is that everybody, it's often when we think about energy poverty and energy access, it is so cut off from a systems view, and in some ways also kind of pathologizes patterns of energy use in this quote unquote market or segment of energy users. And really the emphasis in this kind of framing is to say, no, the entire system needs to work. You can't have the system functioning for some and not for others. And so when we think about issues of cross-subsidization, when we think about access, when we think about local economic development, it must be for this whole system view that no one is kind of left out or marginalized and then has to be brought back in again. So, and then, implied within that is, of course, universal electricity, universal and equitable, right? So not just that everybody has got a connection, but what kind of connection do you have? What can you do with it? That all users contribute fairly to long-term grid costs. And, this has obviously this is a tremendous issue that needs to be unpacked. We will probably have all seen the misinformation that was circulated in the media about Eskom trying to exploit people who are installing their own energy panels. Again, just points to the lack of information about and the lack of understanding about the economic value of the grid, of distribution grids, and the financial value of distribution grids as well, and really not understanding the connection between value and cost and then prices that are associated with different services as well. And then, of course, electricity that supports human and social development goals. So the outcomes that we identified was we tried to really keep in our minds that electricity systems are complex social and socio-technical systems. And so really, it's not so much about, what do we call it, sort of linear goals that we can, goals and sort of linear pathways of change that we can set. It's if you change one thing in a system, you impact throughout that complex system. And so we were thinking about, what are the parameters, the just transition parameters that we might use to optimize that system so that we might, over time, realize this vision of a just and sustainable grid community across different municipalities. And so those outcomes that we identified were local energy reliability and security. And so obviously this was seen as fundamental to achieve all other outcomes. Least cost service provision, obviously that you want that principle of financial efficiency as well. Thirdly, we have energy planning that is aligned to economic development planning, and energy use that is also low carbon. So again, this is not the last word on just transition goals, but we had to put something out there so that we could think together and not just get caught in kind of problem identification, which is often where we get stuck because we are faced with so many challenges and problems. So if we can go to the next slide, there are okay, so then we moved on to identifying, now that we had this kind of framework of challenges, we moved on to identifying of goals, we moved on to identifying what might be barriers to just transition outcomes. And so the challenges that we identified fell broadly into two categories. So firstly, technical challenges, and then financial and broader economic challenges as well. And our big insight here was that, the technical challenges, and I think our colleague from SALGA alluded to this with regard to water and sanitation as well. They have some complexity, of course, but in theory that can be solved if we had limitless resources, limitless financial resources as well. They could be solved with not only current technologies but future technologies as well. So we are in a transition, and often we forget that in a transition we don't have to have every single solution to every problem right now. There will be change along the way, and we actually can't predict all of those changes as well. So so then from a financial perspective, financial constraints, the flows, rules, and processes of financial resources and pertaining to financial resources, as well as the socioeconomic conditions, energy poverty, unemployment, depressed economic activity, municipal revenues that are obviously strained, resources that are strained, really are what add the depth of complexity to the challenge of just transition. So if we move forward, we identified 9 different categories. Sorry, we can go to the next slide. Thank you very much. We identified 9 categories of challenges. So, and these were, we also prioritized these challenges. So in terms of the technical challenges, we identified 3. So the big issue is around distribution grid management. So that's to do with the maintenance of the grid, which we know has not been sufficient. So we're not ready for this energy transition. And so specifically, as there now is huge excitement for embedded generation, for deeper penetration of renewable energy at various scales, we know that a significant proportion of that generation is going to want to connect to distribution grids, and we are not ready to evacuate that power. So that's not going to be great. So there's an issue of sequencing, an idea of sequencing investments as well. So if we go ahead and incentivize massive investment in generation without this preparation, this is going to be disastrous. Then also looking at grid management, grid stability, issues around feeding into the grid safely and affordably for the municipalities, local grid planning, that is sort of local scale mini IRPs, which are being trialed in various municipalities around the country. That's local municipalities, metros, as well as districts as well, which is an interesting new level of energy planning that's emerging. And then looking at the role of storage in as a grid management tool as well. Then secondly, was thinking about demand management, shaping demand profiles, load prioritization, thinking about the future demand, the impact of the electrification of everything. So obviously electric vehicles is an obvious example of, if we want to electrify vehicles, we are going to have to think about having more electricity as well, so that we can meet those needs, but also think about the integration of those vehicles into the grid, what the role of that storage is in terms of grid management, et cetera, smart metering, billing systems that actually work, communications protocols, etc. And then thirdly, thinking about standalone systems that are in areas that cannot be electrified by connecting to the main grid, and what the implications of those systems might be. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in a diversity of ownership there, so community ownership, for example, or some sort of private service provisions, and there's examples of that as well. And then what does that mean in terms of the municipality's responsibility? And then of course these standalone systems are not just in unserved areas or underserved areas, but increasingly also in residential developments across the country, new residential developments that that require services. So, you know, then it's not just thinking about electricity, obviously it's other services as well. And how does the municipality think about and respond within regulatory frameworks, within their constitutional mandate as well, to those kinds of systems and initiatives. Then if we move on to financial challenges, obviously the municipal revenue model is the big issue. Then also electricity tariffs. You know, at the moment the big emphasis is on you know, wheeling tariffs and SSEG tariffs and that kind of thing. But we also have to think about affordability and the way that electricity is subsidized and cross subsidized as well. You know, that we have a lot of entrenched thinking about who pays for whom and how costs ought to be managed. And what came through in our discussions was that, you know, a lot of that conventional wisdom needs to be revisited. A lot of our assumptions need to be revisited as well. And yeah, we started that thinking. I'm sure that thinking is also happening in other pockets, but it's about bringing everybody together. Then we have to think about system costs, unbundling our system costs, the cost of load shedding, distribution costs, the cost to the system of SACG, the cost to the system of storage, and then lastly, think about issues to do with local economic development, carbon pricing, green energy. You know, do municipalities want to sort of transition their electricity supply also to attract certain kinds of business, and meet their own sort of climate goals as well. And then big issues are skills. We know that we lack capacity across different municipalities. How do we retain skills? How do we get people skilled up to deal with managing much increasingly complex local electricity systems? And then, of course, procurement is a bugbear which comes up across different infrastructures as well. So power purchase agreements, wheeling agreements, but other kinds of procurement too. So if we move on.
Lauren?
Yes?
Hi, Lauren. I'm afraid we are running out of time. Maybe do you want to just conclude? Some of those may come up later when we open up for a discussion. Is that fine with you? If you can just maybe wrap up for in the next 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine with me. Can we just move to the next slide though, and I'll stop there.
All right.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, so really the key was to say, you know, actually these challenges are well known and understood partially in different parts and by different actors, and it's really about bringing everybody into a coherent frame. But the big issue is that how we solve those problems depends on how we prioritize the just transition parameters for the system. So our colleague used this possible trade-off between efficiency and equity. We used similar language to think about, you know, is it about optimizing for least cost? Is it about optimizing for local energy security? Is it about LED, local economic development? Is it about just the, you know, low carbon, for example, as well? And you can't have everything all at once. A system can't be optimized for everything. So at some point, we do have to have those conversations, and we need to be real about it, and we need to be transparent about it as well, because that's a big part of the just transition that gets left off the table is the procedural justice, and making sure that everybody understands why decisions have been made, how they are made, and where they can also feed into those decisions. I'm done.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you so much. Talking about conversations, can we pick up this conversation? Maybe, I mean, our audience, can they pick up the conversation with you in the lounge? We have a nice facility called the lounge. If you have any discussions to pick up with Lauren, please join her in the lounge immediately after this session. There's so much to learn from there. And we're going to swiftly move on from you, Lauren. Thank you once again for such an insightful presentation. We are out of time, and we are banking on the next two speakers, Dr. Letsepa Pakkies and our last speaker, Kolisang, to really save us here from the time perspective. So I'm quickly going to introduce Letsepa. Mhlonishwa, are you around?
Yes, I'm here. Good.
All right. Morning, Mhlonishwa. That's Dr. Letsepa Pakkies from the National Treasury Local Government Fiscal Framework Director in the Intergovernmental Relations Unit. He is the director there, and this position requires him to ensure that the allocation of local government determined by or in compliance with the constitutionally assigned power and functions, and that the resources that are available to local government are used to meet their expenditure obligations. Before he served in the Ministry of Finance, or before this role, he served in the same department on several roles, including being a director of higher education and training, overseeing the implementation of free fee. That's a word, free fee higher education and training. Currently, he's leading the review of all conditional grants. Couldn't have speak any better speaker than you, Dr. Pakkies. Mhlonishwa, when you're ready, you can kick it off.
Thanks a lot. I'm Avusana. I'm almost blushing now. Yeah. Good morning to everyone else. It's a pity I can't see everyone, so it's one of those strange conversations that we're gonna have this morning. I would have loved to see everyone's reaction as we go through some of these issues, which I think are quite pertinent. And I really enjoyed listening to the speakers that have spoken before me. The issues around the equity and efficiency, those are the issues that we're busy grappling with. Just transition, another issue as well, that we can no longer take for granted now. Also enjoyed the reflection that we got earlier on from the DDG, from KZN Copter. I think it was quite insightful as well. I think at the heart of my presentation really is just to take you through, colleagues, the local government fiscal framework, how we think about, the funding and the principles around it in terms of how we then fund the various projects in local government. The key element that I should be talking about is the issue of the sustainability of these grants in light of their contribution to the sustainability of the provision of basic services to our communities. So these are just some of the areas that I'm going to touch on. I'm going to be mindful of the time, so I might not talk to all, but then I will share the presentation with everyone involved in their annexures as well, to just give a more, to give more detail in terms of what it is that we do. I think where we sit, I think we've been thoroughly covered in terms of, the intergovernmental system, how it works, the interconnectedness around that, the various roles of each of these spheres. I think I just, perhaps from my own side, just to add that, the capacity to be able to raise revenue, what we call the fiscal effort, and the ability to then do that, are some of the things that have an impact in terms of the sustainability of services. So we do make these allocations to these subspheres of government, and the funding that we then make available flows through the division of revenue in terms of the conditional grants. And it's suffice to say, in terms of, the whole intergovernmental space, we don't make decisions on the behalf of the subspheres of government. So their executives in each of these spheres have the ultimate responsibility to then make informed decisions, taking into account what the communities would have indicated as priorities through the various processes, especially for local government, that would be the IDP processes as well. So from a national perspective, the legislation and the norms and standards are then, that's where they are set. And from where I sit with my very informed team, we then look at each of the changes, in terms of those norms and standards and regulation, whether they've got any impact on local government, and where there is that sufficient funding is being made available to deal with that. Without really saying much, so our role in terms of providing funding to local government is taken from the Constitution, specifically Section 214, which really says, subnational governments are, entitled to an equitable share of all the nationally raised revenues, and really that's really what determines the allocation. So when it comes to the equitable share, municipalities spend it as they please. We've done costing in the past, that helped us determine the cost of providing the service to the municipalities when they provide the service to their households. And it is those costs then that we then use and update them on an annual basis based on what the bulk tariff costs might be. So we're really guided here by NERSA as well as the water boards in as far as that is concerned. So it's quite important to note that it's a process that is well costed, that really informs it is informed by the cost of providing that particular service. So having said that, colleagues, so before you should be seeing, the actual fiscal framework, which just shows the various shares to the various spheres of government in terms of the conditional grants and equitable shares that go to either the provincial government or the local government sphere. So it's important to then note that although local government, as you can see there, has the smallest share in terms of the allocations for local government, but we're talking about, close to it's 87 billion in this current financial year that flows from the equitable share to local government. So that's the amount that is divided amongst the 257 municipalities. We use the status aid data there, and also, as I mentioned, some of the data that comes from the regulators and what ESCOM then sets and what the regulator then approves in that regard. So I think what I want to show in this slide is that, from where we sit, these are the various elements that we take into account in deciding how much then should be made available to local government. Firstly, as you can see, this is one sphere that is really endowed with a lot of revenue-raising powers. So the transfers, whether direct or indirect, that come from the national sphere really contribute towards the achievement, of the basic services. But it's just a small portion because most of the services that are rendered at the local government level lend themselves at cost a recovery. So as you can see there, the service charges that are available to local government to then try and do that. And also from the fiscal side, there's also quite a number of them. So when we talk about the equitable share, it's just one element. We also have, the other funding that then falls specifically to your district municipalities, which is the RSC levy replacement grant, which also augments, the funding that they have. And this is also the sphere of government that has powers to then raise, go to the market and borrow. My colleague will speak more around them. So these are all the considerations that get to be taken into account when deciding on the allocations. And of course, I must add that, looking at all that is available to local governments, so the issue of the share, that it's a smaller share compared to the others, really is a mute conversation, given that, these other revenue-raising powers that are afforded to this sphere, which actually are not available to other spheres of government. So just to give context, I know the issues about the sustainability of conditional grants, but it is quite important to note that in terms of the operation side of the basic services like water and electricity, from the equitable share, about 70% of that 87 billion, is actually allocated to fund the basic services to local government. But we do know that local government doesn't really use much of those funds for those purposes. We do know that I think the data that is coming out is that the coverage is almost just below 30% in terms of that, which is quite dismal, really, given that there's a clear indication of the indigent households that do not get services from government, as we heard from the State SA colleagues. So you would have expected that a large chunk of the allocation that is made for basic services actually goes towards servicing the indigents, because those are the subsidies that are meant for that purpose. Then the other components of the equitable share is the institutional. This is where we provide funding for municipality to then be able to maintain its organogram. So to have a functional institution looking inwardly, also you will have an internal audit and CFO, and be able to pay its staff really. So those are the funds that are meant to then serve that. And then you do have the community component. This covers services that are beyond the individual. So this is where, for instance, things like your street light, where you can attribute it to one person, things like your municipal health, as well as fire services, things that are more community based in nature. So that's what that component is going. And really just on the issue of equity. So because some of the municipalities have better revenue raising powers, they do not get this institutional as well as the community services components. So this is really just for your non-metro municipalities. The only metro that gets those two components is Buffalo City. So the other 7 do not get that, but they get the full allocation in terms of the basic services. And as we've heard before, that poverty is urbanizing in a way. So which means if you look at really the data, you would then see that there's quite a lot of funds that are flowing to the metros to service the poor, because the principle of public finance is that the funds should follow the function, and that is what we try to achieve through this process. So this is where we bring the issue of equity in allocations. Now, having said that, colleagues, then there is that component which also about, I think, 10% of it. So if you're looking at 87 billion, therefore you're looking at 8.7 billion of that allocation for basic services is actually meant for repairs and maintenance. And from what you've heard, in this past couple of days, is that there's inadequate financing for maintenance. And that's a big challenge because we have introduced conditional grants in the system that then fund the infrastructure. There's quite a number of grants. I'm going to introduce them to you at a later stage that fund infrastructure, but it is just important to note that there's the conditional grant system has evolved over the years. We've had quite a number of grants introduced in the system with the sole purpose of, for instance, where a particular national policy is not being prioritized at a local government, but we've also had, the trying to manage the issue of concurrent functions. Then a grant would have been introduced where there are norms and standards that are not funded, then we can have. But we also have some other capacity building grants which are meant to assist a national and provincial government to provide the support to municipalities as envisaged in Section 144 154 of the Constitution, but in the main, the grants that we have in the system are really, meant, to help us address the backlogs. So the question of whether we are succeeding there or not, I think that I will leave it to you, because of you will see in my next slides, how much you spent in the system and for how long. But then you would have heard from the stats colleagues, in terms of the access to services, how that one is going. So this slide really just shows the evolution of this. It's a very messy slide, so I'm not going to talk much to it, because there are some of the grants that are not even showing here, but it just shows just how massive the system is. So there's quite a number of those grants that are flowing to the different types of municipalities, which I'm gonna speak to now, and trying to address really the issues that are quite pertinent to us in terms of the basic services. Most of them really, they focus on water. So water is one of the areas. I think there's about 2, 4, and then 5 grants in the system that are really trying to address the issues around water. By 5, I'm including some direct and indirect ones. So how we then allocate and decide on which grant and how to package, each grant. We look at, issues like the relative scale and the capacity or the capability, of a municipality. So, for instance, you would see that the metros where the organizationally, these are functional for the most part. We do have issues in the metros, but for the most part, there's a functional, they've got the capacity, so they would get some discretion in terms of how to use the grant system. And when I talk about but when you talk about the more rural, then that's where, even the number of grants that flow there, it's quite a number of those, quite a lot of enforcement and support that is needed for those grants to be then spent. So here really is just how the grant system is looking. We try to look at the urban, rural, and then the mix. So these are the grants really. When you talk about the rural municipalities, you'd see that it's quite a number of those where we are targeting, backlogs from all the angles. Because we've got the biggest grant that flows to local government is your general purpose grant, which is the MIC. It goes to non-metro and non ICM municipalities. But then the other grants try and complement and focus on specific issues and the issues of just transition now, as well as, climate change. We have, I think, one grant in particular that is looking at that, but we are reforming the system now, so we should be looking more at how we can focus on that one. So in terms of the grants, really, I mean, we've got, I don't want to talk as if Vusi, you are already there, so I'm out of time. So I'm just going to try and wrap up soon. So we've got different types of grants, but they are all aimed at, addressing a particular issue. So, for instance, I spoke about the metro. So those are the municipalities that then receive the Schedule 4 grants, which are supplementary, but others really would then get, those project-based grant where, the sector department would then transfer funds to municipality and then helps the municipality in spending there. But we're seeing an emergence of the Schedule 6 grants where actually national government is taking over the function from the municipalities through that process of taking the funds, but the function stays there. Then, the asset is transferred. Yeah. We're seeing the issues because the issues start emerging when you transfer an asset to someone who didn't build it, in terms of ownership, in terms of whether they provided sufficient support in terms of maintenance, a budget. I'm not going to talk to that. So the grant system, is under siege. One. Yes, Mavusane.
Maybe let's conclude. Let's maybe just touch a few points and then wrap it up from there.
Okay.
Sorry about
Okay.
that.
Okay. No. That's fine. I mean, the performance of the grant system is also such that the grants are under siege because a lot of money is being put through the system, but it's not being spent. That's an issue. Also, there's high dependence on the grants, and looking at the fiscal environment, that is also a risk that poses a risk to the sustainability of the grants. The issue of asset management, of course, we're spending too much money building, but we're not maintaining the assets. And then there's also the issue now of all the inefficiencies that have been spoken to about by the colleagues.
Yeah.
They all contribute towards that. And as a result, as the Treasury will then reviewing the grant system so that it can talk to some of these issues that have been identified. I like the point from the previous speakers around, data. We need to get to the data that
Yeah.
is going to help us make informed decisions around asset maintenance. We're happy with the statistics South Africa's data. It really helps us. It informs all the allocations that we use because we know where the backlogs are. So the census data is going to be quite helpful in us reforming the system. Thank you very much, colleagues. I'm just going to end at that point. I appreciate your comments and questions, really. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Ending at high point indeed. Thank you so much, Mhlonisha, for that point. And really, the grant system is something that needs to be reviewed to ensure how its sustainability. A lot of issues we talked about, but don't go any far. We'll announce a new arrangement on how we can deal with some of the questions that will come in a bit later. But stay put. And I saw a few questions coming in for you. I can guarantee you that you'll have a chance to talk to some of our audience. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
You're most welcome, sir. We're now moving to learn about a bit about alternative funding mechanisms for municipalities by someone that works closely with Dr. Pakkies, that is Kolisang Molukanele, who's also at the National Treasury. Is a senior economist in the local government finance policy directorate, responsible really for the reforms of local government own revenue sources, and his role, among others, entails recommending and introducing own revenue reforms to enhance local government fiscal system, reviewing existing policies and legislations, especially making recommendations on the municipal borrowing policy there, and introducing alternative funding mechanisms to municipal infrastructure. He has, I should tell you this, a BCom in econometrics and economics and econometrics, and a postgraduate qualification in financial and monetary economics from the University of Johannesburg. Good to have you, sir, with us today. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm good. Thank you, Vusi. How are you?
Good. I'm very well. Thank you so much for asking, and you can take it away from here.
Thank you very much. So good morning to all the students that are here, our esteemed students, as well as public sector practitioners. I'm just going to take you through, the purpose of my presentation is just to take everyone through, as you've heard over the past sessions, that there's a great need for infrastructure investments, especially at a municipal level. And I'm just going to take you through the various ways in which local government can actually finance these infrastructure investments over and above the usage of conditional grants, which my colleague Letsepa has spoken to earlier. So I won't dwell so much on the slide. I think we all know it. Municipalities, everything happens within a municipal boundary. It's through municipalities rendering services such as water and electricity. It increases the quality of life. Through infrastructure maintenance, it increases investment within the municipality. So everything really happens within a municipal boundary. And as we see in the diagram on the right, this is the spatial structure of municipalities. And what we always try and speak to municipalities about, that there's a need for them to make really strategic investments within their boundary. As you can see, that there's a disconnect between underserved townships and CBD, where mostly economic activity takes place. And certain municipalities have invested either in housing closer to the CBD or in transport to make it more efficient and cheaper for people in underserved townships to reach the CBD. And these are all financed through some of these alternative funding mechanisms. And as we know that spatial transformation or spatial form costs more to the poor household, and the state ultimately has the back and dampening growth within the state if poor households can't be inclusive within the growth of a municipality. So when we talk about infrastructure need, it's very important for us to take it back to the rands and cents. So in the little text underneath the bar chart on your right, you'll see that there's a need for about 1.7 trillion rand in infrastructure investments over the next 10 years. And that loosely translates to about 170 billion rand that needs to be invested in infrastructure year on year. But as our colleague from SALGA, Lubabalo, had alluded to earlier, there's a lot of inefficiency when it comes to infrastructure spending, which we need to really, really grapple with as the national government alongside the provincial government in terms of assisting municipalities get to where they need to get. But if you look at the bar chart and really where the investment needs are, you'll see that in metros, metros need about 758 billion rand. Secondly, in certain districts, especially C2 districts where they have a water function, they'll need about 370 billion rand in infrastructure investments, as well as secondary cities, they'll need about 251 billion rand in infrastructure investments. And our view is that the municipalities, especially if you look at your metros and your secondary cities, have the balance sheet capacity and their own revenue sources that are very key in them leveraging in order to meet these targets. And what it requires a lot of coordination amongst the three spheres of government. It requires good planning, but planning is nothing without implementation, and that's where we're lacking. We also need a deeper access to private financing, and that's what I'm going to get into. When we talk about long-term debt, we talk about broader participation in the market, and we talk about innovation and innovative financial instruments like tax increment financing, so that we can be less, or municipalities that have this power, own revenue power and borrowing power, can be less reliant on grants, as my colleague had alluded to earlier, Dr. Pakkies, that the grant system is currently under siege. And it's time for municipalities like your metros and your secondary cities to start going out to the market, and for them not to be so dependent on conditional grants. And also what we say is that at times it may be very costly to build up these spatial transformative projects. But once you get into it, it leads to sustainable increases in expenditure, because once you have these spatial transformative projects, and municipalities can levy these charges, such as electricity charges, water charges, they can levy property rates. It's in a sense a virtuous cycle where whatever you invest in does have a return. So this slide just shows, the sources of capital expenditure and what we've seen over the years. So you'll see that from when we just look at metros and secondary cities, from about 2010, 2011, borrowing had made up a very good amount of capital expenditure within metros. However, due to the over-reliance in conditional grants and the increase in conditional grants, this has fell by about 5.5% a year to about 28.5%, as we've seen in 18-19, and this is pre-COVID. And when you look at post the COVID pandemic, it has fallen even sharply because of the impact that COVID has had on these local municipalities and their economies. And when you look at secondary cities, they have the largest share of internally generated funds as a means to finance the capital expenditure. But as the years have went by, you'll see in the blue, in the stacked graph, the blue, the parts that are shaded in blue are the growth in conditional grants. And as we've heard, and as we would emphasize, I mean, this is not sustainable. Grants alone cannot solve the issues that we have in terms of infrastructure investments within municipalities. So there's a need for municipalities to tap into private sector financing. So when we say as National Treasury and as government, when we say go into the market, this has to be established by principles that are already there, principles that we can all understand, and principles that are basically edged out in current policy. So the next few slides are going to go into the principles that underpin municipalities going out to the market, as well as the legislative prescriptions that are there that allow them to do that. So when we look at the first set of principles, we have a municipal borrowing policy framework that sets out the principles in which municipalities should engage with the private sector in terms of bonds and loans and things of that nature. And some of the principles that are there and that we emphasize is creditworthiness is very important to access private capital. And creditworthiness is essentially saying to municipal or saying to a bank or private sector funder or investor, giving them the confidence that as a municipality we can pay you back. And that entails being financially sustainable as a municipality, having your governance right, and having your planning right. Now, we know the situation that municipalities are currently facing. We are not naive to it, but we do know that there's some really well-managed municipalities out there that have the capacity to go out to the market. The second principle is that municipalities should borrow in the context of long-term financial strategies, which reflect their clear priorities and useful life of assets. So having a long-term financial strategy at a municipal level is very important. As a municipality, you'll need to see where you need to be in 20 years. That is from a planning perspective. We do have frameworks in place when you look at infrastructure planning for 20 years, but also linked to that, you should see that how are you going to pan out financially for 20 years, so that when you say we want to take out a 20-year loan or a 20-year bond, how would that look like year on year? Are we going to be constrained? Are we going to be freed up? How is that going to look like? So that is a very important principle that municipalities should adhere to. And we would like the proper pricing of risk. As government, we don't support soft or subsidized loans, and that's really in an effort for a bank or a lender or private sector financier to look at a municipality for what it's worth, not for what national government can give to back up the municipality. But once this is there, it creates a very healthy, sustainable market, because if a funder looks at you and says you're good, they lend to you on that basis and not what national government can do. And this strengthens the autonomy that municipalities have. And the fourth principle is that investors whose funds are at risk have both the incentives and means to limit or deny the credit if there is any doubt about the sustainability of the proposed borrowing. And this really links to, as national government, and as what we say, that we want a market-based policy where an investor has the right to say, if they don't see you as being at risk or financially sustainable, they are going to deny you the credit. And what that does actually for municipalities, they go back to the drawing board and say that we need this money. We need this loan that we need to take out from this bank or DFI or whatever the case may be. So we need to do the right thing in order to get that loan. And the last principle that we have is that national government will not guarantee municipal borrowing. That means if a municipality defaults on a loan, we will not step in to assist that municipality get out of their struggle. What we do, and is in the law, will assist them in terms of getting them back together. As you've heard probably in the news, financial recovery services, interventions, and the like. But we would want a municipality to really, once they go into the market, they know what they're going to the market for, and that we have a healthy and sustainable municipal credit market. So getting into the next set of principles, I mean, planning is very essential to realizing your goals and implementation too. So we do have certain legislative frameworks that support this. I mean, we have the National Development Plan that sets out the macro view. We have the Integrated Urban Development Framework and the National Spatial Development Framework, as well as sectoral legislations that assist municipalities to put together their plans for infrastructure. We do measure these outcomes. As you'll know, just having a plan for the sake of having a plan doesn't necessarily help. These plans must be measured, and in order for them to be implemented. And obviously, we have the MTEF process that we have as National Treasury and sector departments. We have the built environment outcomes, and we have the service delivery budget implementation plans. And how these things are important, firstly, as I said, to a municipality, it's very important for them to be able to realize those plans and have those plans at hand. But what it does for the private sector is that the private sector knows how to intervene and where to intervene, so that when the private sector goes to a particular municipality, they can use these plans and say, hey, you have a spatial transformative project on the east side of the municipality. We would like to assist you in giving you credit and other services that will help you realize. So having these sort of plans do assist the municipality on one hand, but it also assists the private sector in seeing where areas of growth are and where they can potentially invest. We talked about legislative and policy levers. Lubabalo earlier on raised a very contentious issue about whether legislation is inhibiting or is enabling. From our perspective, we see it as quite enabling, in the sense that Section 230 and 229 of the Constitution has given very big fiscal powers for municipalities to go out to the market. We also have our municipal borrowing policy framework, which outlines the principles, as I've said, but it has been further expanded into a chapter within the Municipal Financial Management Act that says that the power of a municipality going out to the market lies really in the council. So the council can decide if they want to go out to the market or not, obviously through consulting National Treasury as well as their respective provincial treasury for inputs, but the power really lies within the municipality and its council. We also have public-private partnership frameworks that have been established within the Public Finance Management Act as well as the Municipal Financial Management Act, and they're currently being reviewed to make them more streamlined. So that's the Municipal Systems Act. Also allows for the alignment between planning, budgeting, and reporting, as well as the IDP, which citizens are very engaged in terms of where the municipality is planning to invest, as well as I've said, the service delivery and budget implementation plan. We also have SPLUMA, which requires the alignment between all these planning instruments as well as the budgeting, because if you have a plan, it's good to have a plan, but if you don't have the budget to fulfill that plan, then you really are going to be in for a big time when you try and implement. So this slide just shows the access to financing options. As people would know, students and the like, South Africa has a very deep and sophisticated financial market. And on my far left, you'll see there's certain institutional investors that are involved within the financial market. And to my far right, it shows their risk appetite. So, and it shows how much their assets they have in management that can be potentially deployed to municipalities to assist them realize their infrastructure planning. So it is very important for a municipality to understand this, because at various points within your project planning and your project implementation, as you'll see in the diagram below, that, for example, if you are at the beginning of a project, it's very high risk. So when a municipality wants to go out to the market, it's great if they go out to the likes of DFIs who have a very high risk appetite and can potentially come in with project implementation support, procurement support, as well as technical capacity in terms of getting the project to bankability. Then as the project matures, the municipality can take up other institutional investors, such as banks, insurers, and the likes, just to finance the maturity part of their project. So it's very good that a municipality should know who's out there and what they can potentially do for them. So now I'm getting into the alternative funding mechanisms. I can hear Vusi in the background there. So there are plenty that are available. We start off with triple Ps, which people know as a long-term contract between the public and private sector, where the private sector will essentially provide a service for the public sector for a fee. We have development charges, which we have just which we are currently trying to impose through a change in legislation, which are once-off fees that are given for capital infrastructure, for land development and capital infrastructure, which can potentially be levied and leveraged for municipalities to go out and borrow some more. We have project financing, which is essentially linked to the revenue of a particular piece of legislation, or a piece of infrastructure, sorry. And we have pledging, which a municipality can employ through conditional grants. They can use a portion of the conditional grants to pledge in order to finance the infrastructure. Then we have land value capture instruments. We have tax increment financing, which is a concept to capture all the parts or the increments in investing in land and under service pieces of land, because if you can invest in those and start generating property taxes, you can use that to go out to the market and borrow. And we have general borrowing in terms of loans and bonds. It's not as complex as other forms of borrowing, but it's not utilized as much as should be. And then we have climate financing initiatives, to support the just transition, issuing of green bonds and the like, and sustainable bonds, which some metros have done. You can go ahead. We'll see how much time do I have. Sorry.
It's quite interesting to see that the municipalities whilst they have this struggling, or they struggle to collect revenue, they have somehow a leverage on areas where they could easily access the bond market, access the domestic or international capital market, maybe go to take some of the grants there. But look, national government gives quite a small portion of the grants, and that's mostly they rely on, and they raise taxes. The consumers are not willing to oblige to those taxes. It's quite a catch-22 situation, and I get a sense it's not an easy role that you have there. And municipalities as well, I think, speaking to some of what the colleagues have spoken about, they need to work around how they make sure that they leverage and they de-risk some of their assets to get what they rightfully deserve as municipalities. So thank you so much, Kolisang, and sorry to cut you short. I just wanted to make sure that I'm in par with what you just presented with us. Sorry to cut you short. We are totally out of time. But tell you what, here's what we're going to do. For you, Kolisang, for Lauren and Dr. Pakkies, right? I will ask you in this order, right? Humbly request you that, Lauren, if you may go to the lounge table 1, right? And we have Dr. Letsepa going to the lounge table 2. And we'll have you, Kolisang, going to the lounge table 3. So what we'll do now is we'll have participants that have questions on this, on all of you, or one or two of you can jump in from table to table to ask some of the question, or to hear some of the reflections that you'll be sharing there. They can do that pretty much as they walk around the houses, grabbing something to eat as we are on the going to a break, and we'll be back here in about 15 minutes time. We'll be able to do so. Our speaker is still with us here. There was a question that was asked. I won't go to him, and I know it was voted so much around the engineering general, about the office of the general engineering general, owing to the quality of infrastructure, especially at municipal level. But maybe 20 seconds, just your quick reaction, and then we'll close it from there. Lubabalo.
Thanks, Lucy. I think a very difficult question. And speaking as an engineer, I wholly understand the intention behind it, which I think is noble. But I think we also have to ask, when we do that, what are we conceding? Are we accepting that municipalities or government, in terms of the client, is okay not hiring engineers, and we're just going to put this patch onto this much bigger problem? So my concern is, while it's a good idea, there's a lot of questions around it to be answered. And for me, it's a question of saying, are we okay with where the system is, and is this the only solution? And I think not. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Lucy.
Great stuff. Thank you so much. That's Lubabalo Luyaba from the South African Local Government Association, SALGA. From the break or after the break, we are going to a showdown. We're going to a showdown. Stephen Friedman is standing by for us. The Office of the Auditor General, and as well as some other experts are standing by. You don't want to miss that debate coming on after this short break. So we're going to go to the short break. But before we do that, complete the poll and jump into one of the tables in the lounge, table 1, 2, or 3, where you're going to find all our speakers that spoke now. Thank you so much for this session. See you after the break in a 15 minutes time.